Hello everyone and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. On the day that we're recording this, it's about a day after the 2022 midterm elections. And while on the podcast, we usually don't talk about highly topical issues. This particular issue came to mind as a result of what we saw in this recent election. Whether you're in the U.S. or not, one of the general trends that was seen in this election seems to be that candidates who had a little bit more hardball takes on the right or Republican side of things ended up winning their elections, and those that had a little bit more of a softball approach didn't. And another underlying factor here is that most of the folks that didn't end up winning their elections, it seems like a disproportionate amount of them were endorsed by former President Trump, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's
Okay.
kind of partially what I've been seeing people saying about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't investigated all of those claims for myself, per se, but those are the trends that I've heard people talking about.
Sure. And I guess one major standout in this election was how Florida was particularly different than many other states. Florida had basically every single Republican who was on the ballot ended up winning. The whole state went red. And in many cases, those candidates were not necessarily endorsed by Trump or were much closer to the current governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. And you may not be terribly into politics, but I think that this speaks to a little bit of a bigger issue. I think a lot of the reason that people were invested in Trump in 2016 was those that were on the right were looking for somebody who would come out and assert a positive vision for them. Instead of just being somebody who was against a bunch of things, they wanted somebody who was for a bunch of things and would go up against who they saw as their adversaries. And I think that Donald Trump fit this bill for those people, and that's why he ended up being elected in 2016. I think a lot of people who were more right-leaning politically were fed up with that common trope that people say of Republicans are just the Democrats of a decade or two ago. So if you look at Democrats from 15, 20 years ago, those people are going to sound very similar to what modern day Republicans often sound like. And I think a lot of folks in that more right-leaning base were kind of sick and tired of that kind of approach to things. And I think they wanted somebody to actually come out and represent and talk about the principles and things that they cared about. And when Donald Trump came out and started calling out people who the right has often thought are disingenuous, right? People like the media, stuff like that. I think when he calls out the media, when he calls out politicians when he calls out members of government who weren't necessarily elected, career politicians, things like that, I think that people resonate with that.
The establishment.
Yeah.
I think people were itching for someone different who wasn't, a part of the establishment. The usual kind of politicians that you get that are career politicians, part of the swamp or whatever.
Well, and I think part of that view is many see those politicians as these kind of pompous upper class who are untouchable. And I think part of what people liked about Donald Trump was he came in and kind of flipped the script on that, right? He didn't speak like a typical politician. He spoke in terms of demeanor and words used and language like an everyday person would. Now an everyday person from New York, but like an everyday person.
I think that's part of what people liked about AOC too.
Yeah, I think you could say something like that.
She was like a normal person, like any other, random citizen, young, just a bartender or whatever she was doing.
Yeah. And I think whether you agree with Donald Trump or whether you agree with AOC or neither of them, I think that recognizing some of these things is critical. And we're seeing that come in full swing now. And I think one of the things that I saw in this election is, in 2016, it was clear that people were looking for, kind of on both sides, but especially on the Republican side of things, they were looking for somebody who was going to come and fight for what they believe in instead of take a softball approach, right? Somebody who is actually going to be assertive. And I think that was kind of like the version 1. And I think now what you're seeing is an iteration on that with DeSantis, where he seems to be similar in that he's positively advocating for things. And when I say positively, I mean he's advocating for something, not against.
Going on the offense.
Yeah, going on the offense. That's a good way of putting it. And I see him as kind of like an iterative version 2 of something, right? Where he's taking the attributes that people seemed to relate to with Trump, and he's cutting away some of the chaff and some of the issues that people had with Trump, right? I don't think he comes out and he doesn't have this perceived checkered past of
sketchy businessman.
Sure, or even vulgarity, things like
vulgarity,
that.
Right.
There's definitely a different public perception.
Maybe a little bit more professional.
Yeah, but without loss of that.
The hard edge.
Yeah, hard edge, or still speaking in like practical terms that everyday people relate to, I think. And I'm not saying that either or both of these people are great. I'm just saying this is what I'm observing. And I see this iteration as a pretty large leap. Like, I think if you look at something like, do you remember the first iPad that came out?
No.
Okay. Well, I vividly remember the first iPad that came out.
I'm sure you do.
And when the first iPad came out, it sold like hotcakes.
Does that mean it sold well?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
It sold very well, and Apple clearly had a winner on its hands. Okay. And then what happened is, from the iPad 1, the original, to the iPad 2, there was a massive shift in the design of that iPad. It started off, you could only get a black version. Then the second generation, there were black and white models available. There was a full chassis redesign. It was a complete redesign from the ground up. It was substantially thinner. And then they had all of these magnetic covers. And that was a whole new thing with them too. There were a bunch of changes that came to the iPad. Iteration 2 was a massive change. This is oftentimes what you see. The same is true for like the original iPhone versus the second iPhone. You have a massive shift in capabilities. It's a full new redesign and a massive leap forward. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing on the political side here. I think, you've got something that comes on the scene and is thought to be a totally losing product, a totally losing candidate, and then ends up winning. And then people are trying to decipher, like, why is this working out? With the first iPad, people are saying, oh, it's just a larger iPod Touch. Who cares about that? You're just taking an iPod Touch and you're making it bigger. Who would want that? Right? But people weren't thinking about the general market of people. Like, most people, when they sit down at a computer, they're going to do some web browsing. Maybe they're going to watch some media. Maybe they're going to look at some photos. And those are all things that people can sit down and do on an iPad. They can send a couple emails and that's it. And that is what most people are doing. And most people are content and happy doing that on an iPad. And it's easier to teach grandma and it's easier to teach your parents how to use an iPad because you just say, oh, it's like your phone, but bigger.
And they're cheaper than a computer.
Yeah, and it's cheaper than a computer. But all of these folks in the tech space were sitting here going, oh, there's absolutely no way. This is just a blown up iPod. Mm-hmm. It's just a blown up iPod Touch. I think you saw the same thing on the political side. oh, well, this dude, he was a Democrat for a while, and, you know, he doesn't have the political cachet that a typical candidate has, and oh no, you can't go out and advocate for these things. And people ended up really resonating with that. And I think we're seeing that version 2 here. And I think that it's carrying forward kind of like that hardball assertion that you were talking about earlier, right? Positively asserting something, actually playing offense a little bit more. And I think that's something in general that people severely underestimate in society. Like, you can attest to this. I'm a very opinionated person, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And I'm not terribly agreeable, am I?
Oh, no.
And does that substantially change if I'm meeting someone new, or, it's like one of your grandparents or your parents or something like that? Do I sugarcoat things?
No.
Yeah, I'm always the same type of person.
I mean, you might have slight different,
Sure.
like, extremity of your approach.
Sure, but if somebody asks me a question like, "Oh, why don't you like coffee?" or "Oh, you're a coffee drinker, right?" I don't lie about those things. I don't misrepresent myself, and I'll be very clear with people. I'll tell them straight up like, "Oh, no. I don't drink coffee. I think that's dumb. I don't want to have caffeine. I think it tastes absolutely terrible." Right? I'll be straight up with things like that.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody goes, "Oh, well, didn't you love that song or whatever?" I go, no, I didn't like it. I thought it was a terrible song. I thought it was poorly constructed.
Yeah.
It's actually gone so far that we had a friend, a close acquaintance, who would come over, and he'd kind of make jokes. We would hang out with them as a couple, right? And he'd kind of make jokes, and I didn't think that the jokes were funny. And I said to you, I don't laugh at the jokes when they're not funny. Do you remember me telling you this?
Mm-hmm.
And I told you, I refuse to laugh at the jokes, even out of like general common
Social
courtesy.
pity.
Yeah, no, I don't do that out of, that's a great phrase. I do not laugh at jokes out of social pity, because to me, if I'm getting a laugh at a joke, that's positive reinforcement that whatever I'm joking about or quipping about or going on with is actually funny, and I should do more of it. And I refuse to give somebody that positive affirmation for something that like shouldn't receive it. So all that to say, I'm very disagreeable with things, even with people that I'm meeting for the first time. And you'd think because of that, because I'm so opinionated about things, and I don't tend to tone that down a whole lot, that most people would kind of be like put off from me, right? I think that's most people's knee-jerk assumption when they hear that.
I think when people don't actually interact with you, yes. The general perception that people get of you is, oh, he's just kind of a grump, not very interesting, boring dude who's kind of got a resting bee face, you know what I mean?
Well,
Because,
yeah,
like,
I'm
if
either talking to somebody or I'm not talking to
I know,
somebody.
but I'm saying of people who merely observe you and don't actually interact with you,
Sure.
I think that's the impression. Of people who actually interact with you and are able to have a conversation with you,
Mm-hmm.
I think that they have a very different perception of that. And
Yeah.
it's very interesting because, well, it's interesting for me and has been in the dynamic of our relationship, because when we're
Mm-hmm.
in various social situations, people have a very different view of you, literally just depending on if they've had a conversation with you or not, or if they've merely
Sure.
observed you without actually having a conversation with you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been to the point where, like, in college, I was in small groups with, different friends of mine, right?
Mm-hmm.
From our college campus ministry, and some of these friends knew you quite well and
Yeah.
were very comfortable around you and talked to you a lot, and really
Mm-hmm.
knew you and understood who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And other of these people in the small group never talked to you, only saw you in passing at like our church groups, and didn't actually interact with you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because some people would make these weird comments of like, "Oh, I don't understand like him." I'm not gonna say your name, but I don't understand him. Like he seems like such a grump, like
Yeah.
so unhappy. Like he never has joy in his life. He's too serious of a person.
Well, and
All these
somebody
things, and
didn't.
someone even someone even said to me like half joking, but she definitely had a side of seriousness in this question
Hmm.
she was asking me of like are you guys like okay?
This
Do
is
you
when we
do,
were engaged. Yeah.
yeah, do you guys enjoy being around each other? Like he's a fun person, he's a like happy, joyous. And in this specific small group we were in where this was being asked, it's funny because I was like, "Oh yeah, like he's actually super goofy because you are. You're a very goofy person, actually."
And depending on the
Yeah, and
circumstances.
then
But yeah,
I had
yeah.
like one or two friends in this small group who did know that side of you and backed me up, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, yeah, he's like one of the goofiest people I know. Super funny to be around, like great person to hang out with,
Yeah, I'll joke around a lot with the
interesting
right
person to
people. Yeah.
talk to, very interesting. Always has interesting ideas and insights about things." And so you'd get people who had that impression, and then the other people who were like, "I just can't understand that," because they never had a conversation with you. So
Yeah.
I think there are two sides of like, once people do talk to you, they get that. Like I think you're a pretty authentic person, and you are disagreeable and you have opinions about everything, but you also are readily willing to articulate opinions about things if
Hmm.
people care to talk about them. And I think people find
Yeah.
that interesting, but when people talk to you, like it takes being willing to sit down and talk to you, not just having a passive
Hmm.
acquaintance with you, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
I mean, I think you're getting at a bit of what I was saying earlier, which is I'm either having a conversation or I'm not.
Yeah.
Right? We're either going to
Oh, you
sit
don't do
down and
small
talk
talk.
about something.
That's the other thing, right?
Yeah.
You don't do small talk, so it's like I'm either not gonna really talk to you, because we're just gonna maybe we'll make eye contact and like nod if we know each other or
Sure,
whatever.
yeah. Hmm.
I'm either not gonna talk to you or we're gonna talk about something, and
Yeah.
it's going to be an interesting conversation. I'm not gonna waste my time with small talk.
Yeah. Well, to me it's like, "Oh, how's the fam? Oh, they're good, whatever." Like either A, let's actually talk about how your family and you are doing, and let's talk about I don't know what parenting struggles you're going through.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What you've learned at different age stages with your kids. Right?
Yeah.
We're either going to talk about something like that or let's move on to another topic.
Well, I think that you tend to approach conversations with people with the mentality of I want to learn something interesting about you. Everyone has
Yeah.
something interesting about them,
Yeah.
and I feel like you take this approach of I want to figure out what is interesting to you and what are you passionate about, and I want to talk about that because I want to learn something from you. If you're passionate about something and I don't know anything about it, that's how we end up at a funeral and you're talking for 3 hours with the mortuary guy who runs the funeral home, and
Yeah.
you're picking his brain about all these questions. Or at
Yeah.
a party in high school that some random like popular girl is putting on or whatever, and you're talking to the parents about how they run their farm
Yeah.
at this party because like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting. Or you're talking to a random girl at a party that no one talks to about gymnastics because you know nothing about gymnastics, but she's very interested in it. And it's like
Hmm.
I feel like you take this approach of everyone has something they're interested in or they're passionate about, and what can I learn from you? I don't want to sit and talk about small talk. I want to talk about something you're actually interested in
Yeah.
because I think I can probably learn something from you.
Yeah. Well, I just think like everybody is. I mean, this is kind of a platitude, but like everybody is so unique and different. And I don't want to just sit here and reflect back to you what you want to hear. I don't want to just mirror your demeanor. I don't want to just like be into all of the same things that you're into. Right? Like this it actually gets boring so quickly. But I want to understand where you're coming from. I want to understand what you're passionate about. And I think that that's the same kind of thing that we're seeing in politics now. People are sitting here and they're going, no, I don't care about somebody who's going to come out and just tell me what I want to hear. I want somebody who's going to come out and tell me their vision for the future. I want somebody to paint a picture for me about where we could be, and then I want them to make steps in that direction.
Yeah. You want people who are going to project strength, project vision, and a willingness and competence to move in that direction.
Yeah.
Rather than just kind of following the tide kind of thing. And I think that's what a lot of people have, like, on the right side of the political spectrum in America, gotten fed up with in our current political state, is these Republicans. This is like what I've heard from a lot of people, these Republicans who are just spineless, weak cowards. They aren't doing anything. They're just kind of like handing over the culture war to the left side of the political spectrum.
Sure,
and I
yeah.
think you've seen, like, in the culture, so much has been lost to that side, and so much has been surrendered to the left culturally, that I think people are starting to say, no, we want some people who are going to stand up and who are going to stand for the values we care about, and actively encourage that and use that as their fuel in how they enact politics when I'm electing you.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of similar to having like a conversation with someone, right? Like when you've got a representative, in a way they're having a conversation with their constituents, right? And I think you can liken it to having just a general conversation with someone, right? If I'm having a conversation with someone and they're just constantly being a yes man, right? And then they go out and they don't really do much there, and they just say yes to everyone and go with the tide, and they don't stand for anything. First off, you get really bored, and then second off, you reach some point where you realize, oh, this person's just going to say yes to everyone. And when you say yes to everyone, you're saying no to everyone at the same time, because you can't be both.
You can't rely on someone who just
exactly.
says yes to everyone.
And like, those people are not interesting to talk to. Those people are not somebody who you want in your corner. Like,
and they don't make good leaders.
Yeah. If I have somebody in my corner, right, whether they're a friend or a representative or what have you, like, I may disagree with them on a bunch of things, but if they hold to what they say, I at least can predict what they're going to do. Somebody who just says yes to everyone, I can't predict what you're going to do. You're just going to change with the tide, with the culture, with whatever's happening. And I think people want, and people are really drawn to, those that actually have a serious opinion or a take on something and are going to express it thoughtfully. And I think you're seeing parallels of this in the church as well, right? You hear the stats all the time. Oh, young people are leaving the church left and right, right? Well, I can tell you what, young people are leaving the church left and right in softball churches, in churches that don't really stand for much at all, who don't preach or talk about difficult things. As a young person, I can tell you unequivocally that there are so many young people who are seriously compelled by churches. It's just specifically churches that actually take a stance on things. Now, you may not agree with those things, but when a church comes out and they have an actual stance on what you should be doing in your life, and they're calling people to more, people are compelled by that. People are attracted to that, even if they disagree on certain things, right? Because the benefit there is, when you have an actual stance, you have to stand behind it. You have to defend that. You have to justify that. And I think that's what people find interesting. I think people find it compelling. And I think it's so interesting to see this play out, in my opinion, so clearly across like the religious theological side of things, across the political side of things, and then also from what I've seen in my personal life. Like, people actually do want somebody who's going to stand up, somebody who's going to disagree, somebody who might be more contentious. It seems kind of backwards, but I think so many people are in that camp, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. People are sick of just sitting in a limbo, in some wishy-washy, lukewarm zone. I think that's probably a good comparison. Like, if you had three options of like water to drink, you have hot water, cold water, and lukewarm water. Like, what order are you going to choose them in?
Hot or cold depends on my mood.
Sure, or the temperature outside or whatever.
But lukewarm is always last.
Lukewarm's always going to be last.
Yeah.
Like the Bible talks about that. I think it's in Revelation. Jesus is talking to like the people in like the end of days, and he says like, it would have been better if you were hot or cold, but you're just lukewarm and I spit you out of my mouth. And I think, I don't know, like I think about that a lot. Francis Chan talks about it in his book Crazy Love. I think it's a great book.
Yeah.
It's kind of a meditation on James, but he talks a lot about like not being in some limbo zone, not being what he dubs like a lukewarm Christian.
Yeah.
Like, you can't.
And I think the church could do a much better job at that too.
Yeah.
Like, the church should be calling people to more. It should be actively taking a stance and encouraging positive biblical values for people. Because people want that. Like, even if people say it on the surface, they don't want people who are just gonna, bow down to everything they say. They want people who are gonna contend with them, challenge them, pull them higher, call them to more.
Yeah.
Even if they don't recognize that on the surface, or maybe they like it for a period of time, just going their own way, having people who just cheer them on and support whatever they're doing. Long term, that's not fulfilling for people.
Yeah.
And people want a challenge that causes them to seek out their potential, do more, and fulfill their duty as a human being.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we kind of talked about this a little bit on the agnostics episode, but like with so many of these things, whether it's politics or religion, I think about it like a moving sidewalk, right? Like, you can't be still on that moving sidewalk. You can't be still with the changing tides of the culture. You'll start moving along with it. You can't just have a neutral yes man take. Not saying anything is saying something. Not making a decision is a big decision. I think this is a piece of solace for somebody who's maybe a bit more disagreeable. Because I think oftentimes I would find myself kind of hampering or pulling back on a point or something that I believed because I didn't want to, like, quote unquote, offend somebody or, come across as too opinionated with some acquaintance or something. And I'm not saying that you don't tailor anything at all, but I do think that oftentimes our society defaults to something that is less opinionated to try and seem neutral or to not actually take a stand on something. And I think that if you take a stand on things, not only do I think that can help you grow in whatever you're taking a stand on because it forces you to justify it in some way, but it also makes you a more interesting person, somebody who's more compelling. And I think that we're really seeing that play out on the religious and political fronts. Well, with that, it's getting late. But recently I've been kind of musing about what I would dub baselines. Right, when we're evaluating something, you need some null hypothesis. You need a baseline of sorts to compare things to. There There's a specific class of headphone dubbed reference headphones. These have a very flat EQ so that you can balance things to a baseline. I try and do that with a lot of things in my life, have a standard flat baseline to be able to compare things to. I don't want my clothes to constantly smell like something, because I think that affects the baseline. So I try and have like a laundry detergent that's not really smelly, and I try and not have caffeine a bunch, or frequently take something like ibuprofen for a pain management or a headache or something, because I want to have a clear baseline that I can evaluate things against. I think considering your baseline on topics, on subjects, can really garner additional insight when you're trying to talk to somebody or compare things. The baseline is really critical. So I think we should be considering baselines more and trying to control for a flat baseline with which to compare things to. But that's just what I've been musing about recently. Thank you again for listening. If you have any thoughts or things that you'd like to hear us talk about, feel free to send us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening. Have a good night.